Today we're visiting with Dave Tilka in his South St. Louis County landscape, and we'll be focusing our discussion and presentation on his sunny spaces, his prairie spaces, his garden spots that are dominated by plants that you would find throughout the Midwest in prairies and glades. Well, hello, Dave.
Today I thought we'd talk a little bit about sun landscapes and sun habitats, sun communities. And we have two basic types of natural communities in the Midwest. One is the glades and one is the prairie. And here we have a good example of a glade community that I have sort of simulated from out in the wild. I bring it home to the suburbs here. And I couldn't get this beautiful plant called rose verbena to grow very well here because it got really wet feet. And rose verbena does not like wet feet. It will get root rot. So I brought in about a yard of dirt and made a berm to simulate the hot, dry conditions that are found about 30 miles to our south in Jefferson County. You also see some other interesting plants here, like the prairie clover, which is already flowered. You got Missouri primrose. You got downy phlox. And you got some other interesting plants, such as wild quinine, which is flowering. These are young plants, so they're not yet mature enough to flower. And then just starting to flower over here, you have Missouri coneflower, Rudbeckia missouriensis. And in the background over there, you got the Coreopsis palmata. And then this cute and cuddly little plant here, it's a succulent. This is called fame flower. It has these little succulent fingers, and then it sends up a flower wand about 12 inches high. I call it the 2:30 plant because it doesn't really start flowering until about 2:30 in the afternoon. Now, glade plants are the hottest and driest of all plants. They have adaptations, like on this Missouri coneflower right here. It has very, very stiff hairs which intercept the sun and keep that plant cool. Also, if you notice the leaves on a lot of glade plants, like this one, the rose verbena, they're reduced in leaf area, so reduced size of leaves. And if you look at this blue star right over here, I'm going to go in front of you. This threadleaf blue star. Again, it's already flowered. It was earlier in the season, but very small reduced leaf size. Because typically glades have very poor, nutrient poor soils, hot and dry. They're usually found on rocky soils. A lot of times these soils or these glades are found on ridgetops or on south and west facing slopes. And because of this, they're adapted to hot, dry conditions. Also, they get the south and west winds, which dries them out. So glade plants, by nature, do not grow very tall. They're typically, somewhat low to the ground, maybe a foot or two high. In the case of the Missouri coneflower, it gets up to a little over 2 feet. And this is Baptisia, or wild indigo, and there's about 3 or 4 different kinds. These have already flowered. This one was the blue, wild blue indigo. It's got the seed pods there. And this is more the exception. This one can get up to, maybe as much as 3 or 4 foot tall. In the wild, though, where you don't have very good soils, I must have had a little bit of good soil right there, and it's gotten a little big. a little big for its typical size.
So can you tell us about your soil here, Dave?
Glade soils, are depauperate soils. They don't have a lot of nutrient buildup. We'll see later on, prairies are richer, moisture soils. But glade soils, there isn't a lot of vegetation that builds up, which enriches the soil. So glades typically drain very fast also. So it could have a inch thunderstorm, and within an hour or two, that moisture is gone. So you have to have, like I said before, the plants that can basically take that hot, dry situation. Now, if you're a homeowner, you have a problem area on the south or west sides of your house, and it gets so hot and dry that you can't grow things very well there. And it's so hot and dry, you want to think like nature and think glade plants. Glade plants are adapted. Rather than fighting the natural character of the site, you need to go ahead and go with the natural character of the site. And again, right plant, right place. So here is a perfect example of going with nature. The second basic type of sun community we have in the Midwest is the prairie. Compared to glades, prairies just are more luxuriant, more diversity, more plant mass. Instead of those very sterile, nutrient poor, rocky, dry soils, in prairies you have more moisture, you have more nutrients because all this plant mass grows, dies, and is recycled into the earth. So a lot of organic material is built up in the soil. And as a result, you get a lot taller plants. And you get things that are 4, 6, even sometimes 8 foot tall. We have a pretty good plant diversity here. This is a highly managed prairie. It's a formalized prairie in the front yard. And I've selected plant species that are showy and that are all about 4, 4.5, maybe 5 foot tall. And the secret to a lot of prairie plants is to plant them in mass. Plant them close together so they have a lot of buddies to hold themselves up. Mitch, most of these plants in this bed were grown up from seedlings. So I did not start from seeds on this particular bed because I wanted to basically speed up the process and have something nice and showy in just a couple of years. So this is a 2-year-old bed. The plants are now fully mature, and you can see that the pollinators are very happy. The diversity here is primarily coneflowers. I have about 3 different types of coneflowers out here. Earlier we had the prairie coneflower, or the glade coneflower and the yellow coneflower. At the end of June, those fade, and now you have mostly the purple coneflower. The white round balls, that's the rattlesnake master. And it's just starting. You see some solitary bees on them. The diversity of insect pollinators is tremendous on these rattlesnake masters. And then, of course, the long cylindrical purple plants are the prairie blazing star. And you can see the silver spotted skipper there, the bumblebees. The bumblebees just love these Liatris pycnostaceae. And again, they flower from the top down, and you can see there's a whole group of them here, and they give each other support. So it's a mass of purple, a mass of bees and butterflies and pollinators, and it's just, this is what I live for. This is cool. This is good stuff. Also, I have some rudbeckias in there, some orange coneflowers, and they just aren't quite as far along yet. But the pollinator diversity is really tremendous right now. I do want to show you a creature comfort that I use. I don't know if you can see it here. I get these little plant props, these wire plant props from Home Depot, Lowe's. I get them typically 18, 20, 24 inches. 18 inches, it's about 98 cents. Now, they raise the price during the growing season, but if you get them before and after the growing season, you can usually get them for about 98 cents. And what I like to do is, if you have things that are leaning over, again, the tall things on the outside may need some propping. So if you would just take your plant prop and just bring your plants like this together, you can go ahead and keep these plants then oriented upward instead of having them lean over. So it gives you a nice, more formalized look. Now these plants were all selected again for their showiness and their limitations, because on some prairies you get, again, very tall plants. You'll notice on the ground, instead of having a lot of mulch, I had a little bit of mulch, but I've gone with a ground cover. This is called prairie sedge. It's one of the sedges that will spread out and it will reseed and it will fill in. Pardon me, because I don't want to do a lot of weeding on this. As this matures, it will become even more ingrained into the ground here, and you will get, again, reseeding of the blazing stars, the rattlesnake master, the coneflowers, and along with the base here, the ground base of the rosy sedge, you'll get a nice mixture of plants. Here we find the non-formal, the more wild prairie. And here I've selected species that get taller than 4 or 5 feet. In fact, you can see I'm about 6 foot, and you can see some of the tall bergamonts or monardas in the back, and they're well over 6 foot tall, along with wild senna, which got over 7.5 feet tall last year. That doesn't mean that there's not taller things out there like compass plant, compass flower, or some of the cup plants, the silphiums and things. But I've decided here to try to give a mixture of fairly tall plants. And I love the yellow. Most prolific flower right here is the yellow gray-headed coneflower, which is just a tremendous bee plant, but the finches really love it later on. They'll be hitting this like crazy later on in the fall. And of course, the tall bergamot is the very tall, dominating plants in the back, along with a smattering of coneflowers. And then the red royal catchfly, which is a tremendous hummingbird plant. And then you get some smatterings of rattlesnake master, a little bit of blazing star from the front, and you get some black-eyed Susans. There's some ironweed in here, some very young Joe Pye weed. You can see it's about to start flowering right here, but that's a very young plant. That was a little pint seedling when I bought it earlier. So, and then I got hairy mountain mint and a few other small species. And what I've done here in the front is I've tried to cut a lot of these back early on. When they first got up to about 3.5, 4 foot tall, I cut a good foot and a half off, and you can see the difference in the flowering on this monarda right here. That was cut back, So it's still flowered, but it isn't quite as tall and lanky as that one. And you can see all of those are grown in mass. That's the good buddy system. They're all sort of propping each other up. And then if you look over to the right side of the prairie, there is the gray-headed coneflowers, and some of those don't have buddies close to them and they're leaning. Now this is my informal prairie, so I'm not really worried about them leaning over a little bit. And heavens to Murgatroyd, the pollinators sure aren't. They just hit them just the same as they're standing upright. So here is, again, an informal but very highly functional prairie. I would not probably put this one in my front yard next to the sidewalk like I did with the other one, because they're a little taller and it's a little bit more wild looking. But it's an excellent mixture to put in your backyard. But yeah, here we basically started off with a patch of dirt. This was a big, well, actually two gigantic bush honeysuckles that were here about 2 years ago. And I basically cut those down, treated the stump with an herbicide, both stumps, and I had this bare dirt, and I decided to go ahead and bring in a prairie mixture, and I brought in seeds primarily. The big monardas in the back, and the gray-headed coneflower, the blazing stars, black-eyed Susans, the heath aster. A lot of these things, most of them were grown from seed, so they are 2 going on 3 years in age. Now, I also brought in some other things like the Joe Pye weed. I didn't have any Joe Pye weed seeds, so this spring I brought in some Joe Pye weed seedlings, and I do have some other seedlings that I purchased. I like to get the smaller ones and just have them mature. Here is the royal catchfly. Okay, this was about a year old. It hasn't started opening. You do have some that are open in the back. That's about a 2-year-old plant right back there. That was not grown from seed. Those I brought in from seedlings. So a good recipe, you can't afford, well, most people can't afford to bring in all seedlings. So what you want to do is get a good framework, a background of plants that you grow from seed to give you your plant mass. And then you can sort of spice it up. Sprinkle in royal catchfly or Joe Pye weed or some showy goldenrod. I got some ironweed that will come on in the fall. And that's the way that is a good compromise situation where, you know, if you're not super rich, you can bring in seedlings, just do the whole thing with seedlings all from the get-go. But again, going with the seeds and then spicing it up with the seedlings later.
My Lord, Dave, what's this in your prairie?
It's a prairie willow, one of the shorter, more manageable willows. And as our friend Doug Tallamy said, we need to really be specific with some of the plants that we choose, because there are some that are more keystone species than others. Oaks have, you know, the most number of caterpillar foods out there, caterpillar species, but I think black cherry, the prunus species, but I think like number 3 or 4 is willow. But most willows are very big and spread like crazy. But this species, and there's different varieties of this prairie willow that only get up to about 8 to 10 feet tall. And it is a robust plant. You can go ahead and trim it back if it's getting a little bit too big for your area. But the vegetation will support hundreds of caterpillars. And as Doug Tallamy has told us, caterpillars, of course, support birds. And the birds need to have caterpillars. You know, for a family of chickadees, many people refer to this you need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise up that nest of young chickadees. The same thing with bluebirds. We had bluebirds nesting here, and bluebirds munched on the caterpillars that were on the prairie willow. Now, there are differences in heights. This one was actually eaten back by rabbits several times, and it hasn't gotten as tall as this one. So you can go ahead if you have a small area and just keep trimming it back. And even willows, the number 3 or 4 caterpillar food source for Doug Tallamy, has said, you know, this is a very valuable keystone species.
So it's called a prairie willow. This willow is not all that needful of water. We think about willows growing along creeks and rivers and streams.
Right. Yeah, this one is pretty drought tolerant, drought resistant. So you can put this one out and not have to worry about, you know, its moisture water needs. And this will do quite well in full sun out in the open.
Well, Dave, I really appreciate you taking the time with us today and showing us around and sharing your landscape with us. Any parting thoughts or words of wisdom for the group today?
Yeah, it's been fun. And it's not a mystery here. If you have sun, 6-8 hours of sun in your landscape, and you have some areas that have fairly good soil that are moist, you can go with prairies. And then if you have some hot and dry, rocky, poor soils, you can go with some glade plants. And you can go to references like, you know, a book, Native Landscaping for Wildlife and People. You should probably go with the revised edition, which has the revised tables in them and a few additional information, tidbits on what plants are better with a lot of the Tallamy data. So yeah, we have some wonderful resources in the St. Louis area as well. A lot of local stores, nurseries that have native plants like Greenscape, Sugar Creek, and the Kirkwood Market when Missouri Wildflowers comes into town. But you can basically make you are the dictator here. You can dictate what kinds of things you want to attract into your wildlife, into your landscape, what kinds of wildlife you want to bring in. I love pollinators. And if you have pollinators, you have good insect production, of course. This is a transition to the vertebrates, such as the birds and mammals. But I love to see things active. I love to see things reproducing, pollinating, preying on other animals, because this is what it's all about, setting up a mini ecosystem in your own landscape. And I love biodiversity as well. We have probably over 100, 130 different species here on our suburban landscape, and we just love it. There's always something going on. And that's what's nice about nature. Sure, only some of the wildflowers will only flower or bloom for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, except for like rose verbena, which is a fantastic plant as far as longevity. But you have this change, this parade of things coming along. And when this quits blooming, you will have other things coming on, and it's just a wonderful, like I said, parade, a kaleidoscope of colors, a kaleidoscope of visitors to your yard. So, and don't think you have to be perfect all the time. People make mistakes. If the plant doesn't like it in one place, move it somewhere else. And don't be afraid to experiment. But remember, when you put those plants in the ground, for the first 2 or 3 weeks, you got to keep them watered a little bit. And then after that, unless you run into extreme drought conditions, this is native plants. They've evolved to adapt to this kind of condition. So take advantage of that. Take advantage of that. You don't have to water them. You don't have to care for them a lot. You just provide the habitat, and if you build it, they will come. If you grow it, they will come. So thanks, Mitch, for coming by. I appreciate it.
Well, very good. Thanks again, Dave, and again, very much appreciate you sharing with us. Take care and stay cool.
Thank you.